At the end of World War I in 1918, the U.S. government did what it always had done when major conflict ended. It downsized the military. The U.S. had 39 battleships at that time. A few were obsolete, having been brought out of mothballs for the war and would soon be retired again. The U.S. reductions to its forces began within hours of the armistice signing. But interestingly, Congress approved a naval expansion of 10 additional battleships. Why? Because for U.S. military policy, the Navy was the nation's first line of defense and the battleship was the backbone of the Navy. So in the interwar period, U.S. military strategy put great faith in sea power. But this arrangement was about to be challenged severely by swashbuckling Army Air Service Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who was on his way home from the war. Billy Mitchell had gained fame as the U.S. Air Combat Commander in France. He led nearly 1,500 American and Allied aircraft in the San Mihiel offensive in 1918, which made him history's first Joint Force Air Component Commander. Returning home from the war, he was already a celebrity. Newspapers followed what he said and did. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French. In England, Mitchell had an audience with King George V, and he took the Prince of Wales up for an airplane ride. Mitchell was a visionary in a very real sense. While stationed in the Philippines years earlier, he visited Japan, and in his 1925 book, Winged Defense, Mitchell detailed how Japan might attack Hawaii, starting at 7:30 a.m., with 60 Japanese pursuit planes destroying hangars and planes on the ground at Schofield Barracks, followed by 100 bombers striking Pearl Harbor's naval base. The Japanese, of course, did in fact attack Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. Mitchell believed that the world stood on the threshold of an aeronautical era and that military power should be independent of ground and sea forces. He was inspired by the example of the British Royal Air Force, established in 1918 as a separate service, combining their arms of the Army and Navy. The irrepressible Mitchell constantly cast aspersions at his superiors, whose enthusiasm for air power, and for Mitchell, was strictly limited. En route home, Mitchell told his fellow passengers on the Cunard liner Aquitania that the General Staff knows as much about the air as a hog does about skating. His comment was reported in the newspapers. Mitchell had hoped to be the Army Director of Military Aeronautics, but that position was eliminated in a post-war reorganization, and Major General Charles T. Manower had been chosen as Director of the Air Service in January 1919. Manower was an artillery officer who commanded the Rainbow Division in France during World War I. His West Point classmate, General John J. Pershing, made sure Manower would keep his wartime rank and arranged for him to head the Air Service, even though Manower had never even been up in an airplane. Mitchell fell back to the grade of colonel as Chief of Training and Operations, but regained his star when he became assistant to Manower, whose position was upgraded to Chief of Air Service. Manower was a professional who took his job seriously, so I just want to quickly show you a recruiting film he instituted which shows you how new this enterprise was as the Army Air Service is recruiting for the Balloon and Airship Division. I'm going to read the recruiting pitch as displayed on the film as I show you the training. Young man, have you ever stopped to reason that the fellow best fitted and qualified holds down the job that pays the biggest salary? Will you be satisfied 10 years from now in your present job and probably your present salary, or do you want to come into the world of achievement? and climb your ladder of success. Assuming you are a genuine red-blooded hustling American, we say unto you, let not financial difficulty stand in the way of acquiring the object of your ambition. The Balloon and Airship Division of the U.S. Army Air Service offers opportunities which cannot be found elsewhere to clean, healthy young men who enlist to earn while you learn in the great university of the Army. Manauer was a good Army officer, but he knew nothing about air power, and he could not control Billy Mitchell. He supported Pershing's view that air power must be subordinate to infantry. Now, in the post-war, Mitchell was challenging the Navy, telling resistant admirals that unless the Navy developed an air force, its battleships were in danger of destruction from the air. In a New York Herald article in December 1919, Mitchell wrote, "Air power will prevail over the water in a very short space of time." A few months later, he used elaborate charts to illustrate to military commanders how, in his opinion, 1,000 planes could be built for the cost of one battleship. Mitchell made powerful enemies with these words. In the 1920s, coastal defense was a much desired service mission because a large share of the shrinking defense budget went with it. Mitchell argued that the Air Service should take over this mission. Airplanes could intercept and stop the invaders far from shore and do it faster and at a lower cost than the Navy could, he argued. To prove his point, he needed to sink a battleship, and as early as the summer of 1919, he began thinking about how to do it. He also believed that airplanes launched by catapults from capital ships would be useful in coastal defense and proposed that the Army Air Service acquire 2 aircraft carriers. This was something of an embarrassment to the Navy, which in 1918 had postponed the construction of its first aircraft carrier. Some naval officers believed in air power, but Admiral William S. Benson, the Chief of Naval Operations, was not among them. He said that, "I cannot conceive of any use that the fleet will ever have for aircraft, and that the Navy doesn't need airplanes. Aviation is just a lot of noise." In August 1919, Benson disbanded the Navy Aviation Division and redistributed aviation activities. He did not inform Assistant Secretary of the Navy and future U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who denied before Congress that the division had been disbanded. He was forced to recant when Billy Mitchell produced a copy of Benson's directive. In 1920, Mitchell told Congress that the Air Service could sink any battleship in existence or any that could be built. He called for a demonstration in which airplanes would bomb ships. Within days, Congress introduced 2 resolutions urging the Navy to provide target ships for the Army. The Navy agreed to bombing experiments on naval vessels carried on jointly with the Army. The rules and conditions for the test were set by the Navy, which made it as difficult as possible for Mitchell to succeed. The ships had to be sunk in deep water, 100 fathoms or more. The Navy rejected 2 locations with sufficient depth close to shore and chose a target area some 50 miles out to sea from the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. Langley Field, the base for Mitchell's bombers, was 25 miles farther west. That made it a 2-hour round trip for the bombers, limiting the time they could loiter the target area. The airplanes were not allowed to use aerial torpedoes, and the Air Service would be allowed only 2 hits with its heaviest bombs. An inspection party would go aboard the target ships after each hit to carefully survey the damage. Mitchell formed the 1st Provisional Air Brigade at Langley and assembled his aircraft and crews for the mission. The biggest available bomb weighed 1,100 pounds, which was not sufficient to sink a battleship. Captain C.H.M. Roberts of the Aircraft Armament Division produced a special batch of 2,000-pound bombs in time for the test. The big bombs would be delivered by two kinds of aircraft. A number of Handley Page O-400s, variants of a British World War I bomber, were in the fleet and capable of carrying large loads. The best airplane, however, would be the one Mitchell chose for his pilots, the new twin-engine Martin MB-2 biplane, then coming off the production lines. It had a cruise range of almost 600 miles and could carry a 3,000-pound load. Mitchell had decided that his pilots would not try for direct hits on the ships. The most effective technique would be a near miss, with the bombs exploding underwater and creating a water hammer to inflict maximum damage on the hull of the ships. The test opened on the morning of June 21, 1921. A large number of Navy ships had gathered in the target area to watch, and about 300 VIP observers were present aboard the transport ship Henderson. Before the tests, Mitchell talks with dignitaries, including Secretary of War Weeks and new Army Chief of Staff Pershing. Here Mitchell explains the bombers to Secretary of War Weeks and General Pershing. The officer on the far right next to Pershing and Mitchell is George S. Patton, who served as Pershing's aide during the 1916 Mexican expedition. Targets were to be 4 former German Navy vessels, including the battleship Ostfriesland, obtained in the peace settlement after World War I and scheduled for demolition. The attacks on the first ships were strictly preliminary events. On July 13th, the Army airmen made their first appearance. The Martin bombers, limited to 300-pound bombs by the rules, sank the former German destroyer G-102 in 19 minutes. On July 18, Navy and Army airplanes took turns attacking the former German light cruiser Frankfurt. No bomb heavier than 600 pounds was allowed. There were frequent intermissions as inspectors dragged out their onboard inspections. air service was finally allowed to strike and sink the vessel with 600-pound bombs. The Navy, which had figured on using gunfire from ships to finish off the Frankfurt, was surprised. But the main event was the Ostfriesland, which during World War I had taken 18 hits from the big guns of British battleships at Jutland, struck a mine on the way home, and was ready again for action 2 months later. The Ostfriesland had been built to be as near unsinkable as possible and had separate watertight compartments so it could not be sunk by any single hole in the hull. The New York Times, reporting from the assembly area at Old Point Comfort the night before the first attack on the Ostfriesland, said, "Naval officers are insisting that the flyers will never sink the Ostfriesland at all." Bombardment of Ostfriesland was planned in several phases spread out over 2 days, July 20 and 21st. A large number of Navy ships had gathered in the target area to watch, and about 300 VIP observers were present aboard the transport ship Henderson. Among them were Pershing, who had become Chief of Staff on July 1, Secretary of War Weeks, Secretary of the Navy Edwin Denby, 18 members of Congress, 50 news reporters, and various admirals and generals. Flying overhead was Billy Mitchell, who accompanied all the bombing missions in his personal airplane Osprey, a 2-seat de Havilland DH-4B. A long blue pennant streamed from the tail for identification. Navy and Marine Corps airplanes went at the Ostfriesland first, spending an hour and 17 minutes dropping small bombs and doing minimal damage. As each service took turns at targeting the battleship, during one point when the Army Air Services were approaching the target, they were ordered not to attack since observers were going on board. When Mitchell complained about the delay, Johnson said it was the airmen's fault for taking off early. Indeed, they had taken off early, by 9 minutes. Johnson and the inspectors kept them circling for 47 minutes, that ended the tests for the day after the air service had dropped only half its bombs. The battleship was still afloat and the Navy gloated. The Washington Post reported, "On the good ship Henderson, Secretary Denby told us how little impression the bombs had made. High naval officers sniggered cheerfully." In the morning of the second day, one of the bombs was a direct hit and the Navy stopped the test for inspection. The Martins returned to base with 9 bombs remaining. The Navy was gleeful. The last shot at the Ostfriesland was set for midday, July 21st. The Army would lead it, a flight of 6 Martins and 2 Handley Pages, each carrying a 2,000-pound bomb. As the pilots stood by waiting to take off, Johnson called in with a change in rules. The bombers could bring no more than 3 of their biggest bombs to the target area. The written agreement, however, had been that the air service would be allowed 2 direct hits with their biggest bombs. Mitchell, disgusted, ordered all 8 aircraft to proceed. He fired off a message to the Navy saying that his bombers were carrying 2,000-pounders and would continue attacking until we have secured 2 direct hits the Army is authorized to make. He received no reply. One of the Handley pages had to drop out of the formation, but the other 7 airplanes went on to the target. They had no intention of making 2 direct hits and stopping the test. Their orders were to aim for near misses to create water hammer shock waves against the hull. The first bomb fell at 12:18 p.m. It was a near miss as planned. The other airplanes swept in at spaced intervals and delivered their ordnance. We could see her rise 8 or 10 feet between the terrific blows from underwater, Mitchell said. The 6th bomb at 12:31 sealed the Ostfriesland's doom. The old battleship sank at 12:40. The 7th airplane, a Handley page, dropped its unneeded bomb as a final salute to the point where the battleship had gone down. Mitchell followed the bombers back to Langley, jubilantly waggling the wings of Osprey as he flew by Henderson. The Navy officers were shocked, and legend says some admirals wept, but they soon recovered their voices. The Navy claimed for years afterward that Mitchell had violated the rules and destroyed the value of the test for determining the effects of various kinds of bombs on ships. But to the press and the public, the outcome was easy enough to understand. Billy Mitchell had sunk a battleship, just as he said he could. Navy aviators joined their battleship comrades in heaping invective on Billy Mitchell, but they were ready enough to take advantage of what he had achieved. The Bureau of Aeronautics was created in August 1921, the first new bureau in the Navy since the Civil War. Mitchell's detractors took great satisfaction when Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline as a result of his virulent public criticism of Army and Navy leaders. Mitchell was found guilty and subsequently resigned from the Army. But the Army was not going to roll over in its competition with the Navy, as both services were always competing for funding. This Army Air Service film shows that the Army and its Air Service were going to advertise their capability. Even before the sinking of the Ostfriesland, the Navy had already allocated another vessel, the pre-dreadnaught Battleship Alabama, to the Army for bombing tests. Mitchell's bombers sank it in Chesapeake Bay a few months later, in September 1921. In another series of tests in 1923, Mitchell and the Air Service sank the surplus battleship Virginia and severely damaged the battleship New Jersey in operations off Cape Hatteras. But the battleship fraternity was not quite finished with its chest thumping. The program for the Army-Navy football game on November 29, 1941, included a picture of the battleship Arizona. A caption read, "It is significant that despite the claims of air enthusiasts, no battleship has yet been sunk by bombs." One wonders what the Navy thought had happened off the Virginia Capes almost 20 years earlier. But 8 days later, Japanese aircraft bombed and sank the Arizona at its moorings at Pearl Harbor.
But there's an interception. Army's big center of Fuson, number 53, pulls the ball down, and Navy's drive is stopped. As Cadet Davis,
As always, thank you very much for watching.
Interference and sweeps around right for 5, for 10. He's in the secondary, and now it looks like Army's really on the move. At least the cadets think so. Well, the Middies are having a tough time with that Army power. Max Minor takes the ball this time and drives through the Navy line for 6 more and another first down. Watch that Army hole open as Davis scampers past into the secondary for 10, 15, 20. He's in the clear. Nope, he's shoved out of bounds on Navy's 24, but it's a 22-yard gain while frenzied cadets yell for a touchdown kill. Army's ready for that kill now with Dale Hall back. Watch the right side of the line open as he knifes through and down to the 10-yard line. The 5, and he's over for the first score of the game and 6 Army points. Red Flake sends in Dick Walterhouse for the conversion. There's the kick, with Walterhouse breaking all collegiate football records with 47 conversions in a single season. And the scoreboard chalks up Army 7, Navy nothing. With 2 minutes left.